continue to be laying by in store, saving up for the efforts that are needed in the future. So I think we can definitely relate to why Paul would be writing this, and it's likely that he was, at least as we'll see in chapter 9, worried that he was confident that they would do the right thing, but worried maybe that he didn't want to show up or have people show up to receive this gift and it not be available. So I think it's important for us to understand that, like, one, when we make commitments, we do our best to follow through with those. But I think it can get more difficult when it is not super specific, right? Like if you give a pledge that I'm going to give $10,000 over the next year, then you can kind of track that, right? But if you are saying, I'm going to give generously over the next year, you can rationalize and fluctuate what that means each week, So what are some thoughts that you all have, even if we think about like how we just had our collection for the building fund, or maybe you've been involved in things at other churches where, there was a large effort that needed financial support, and, how do we not just like give once to that, or how do we stay, involved and invested if it's a long process, so that we're doing what we're supposed to? Yeah.
Where I went to church previously, they had on the first Sunday in January, the budget all the money went to like the mission program, all these programs that we had, and they set an amount. So you knew every January this was going to be and how much the amount was. And every single time it went above the amount. So.
Yeah, and I think that's something we hit on a little bit last week too. Is one of the things that isn't a requirement for giving, because we know that we should do it, is when you know directly where the money is going to go. That can make it a lot easier sometimes to be like, oh, I'm going to set this aside because either I know it's going to an effort that I really do support, but or you might know the person more specifically, right? Like if they've come and talked at your church, or if they're a missionary who started at your church to go off and do things, it's a lot easier sometimes to support those that or efforts that But even just in large, if you know that you are supporting other Christians who are trying to do what you do somewhere else in the world, that can be motivating to us too. Any other thoughts on how we can, make sure, either for big efforts, but I think this also applies, like as we think about like what we're going to give each week too, right? Like sometimes that can be very easy to become just a box that we check, and we might set something up, at the beginning of the year, and especially like there's definite pros and cons to how giving has changed over the years, right? But if you're just mailing a check from your bank account or something's automatic, right? Like a lot of times it's very easy to not to necessarily reevaluate what we're giving every so often. So any other thoughts on like how you keep that in the front of your mind? Yeah.
I was just thinking, it made me think of an occasion for that, what my dad did. The congregation was in the process of making an addition to the building. They got right down ready to do it, but they were short so much, and he actually took out the personal loan to make a contribution to help get to that point. He knew he would be made a commitment to pay it, to do that.
Right.
But he didn't have the money at the time. So that can be done.
Yeah.
And it's not many people would do it, but he did do that.
Yeah, and that is one way for sure that you're locking yourself in, because he fronted the money up front. You are the one that's responsible for making sure that loan gets paid down. And I think that's where, like, we can take a lot of the like principles that we see here as we're studying these 2 chapters on giving, but a lot of the practical, like how we value money can be viewed the same. We can learn a lot of things, but like practically how we go about it, like we discussed, like we have a very different system for receiving pay in most cases and things like that, where we can often forecast out a lot more than they would have been able to in the early church. That doesn't mean we have a guarantee we won't lose our jobs, and that doesn't mean that we have guarantees, that because we're Christians, everything will work for us. But I think like sometimes that can be very beneficial to us, and sometimes that can make it harder for us to give generously, because we're like, well, my pay hasn't changed, so why would I reevaluate, what I'm willing to do or able to do? Yeah.
That every time, we know how much we're gonna make for the year, basically.
Mhm.
You know, if you have a job and you've got this and that. So you said, you sit down, you make yourself your budget, God, rent,
Mhm.
car, whatever. You put this first, and then you budget the rest of it, in that. And so, that's the way we were taught to sit down and do it yearly. Because usually, you get a raise yearly. It might not be much, but it is a raise. So
Right.
you look at that at the beginning and say, this is what I make, and, start from there and go down. And I know our bills are high, our mortgages and stuff like that, but God has to be first in
Mhm.
everything, no matter what you're doing. So you need to look at all this other stuff and say, I'm giving him this much, and then I can make this, and I might only have a little bit of savings left, but, he's let me do this.
Right.
So,
And we discussed this last week too, how it's all, everything we have is ultimately from God, and so we're just stewards of it, and we have to try to make good choices with it. And I think even to that point, right? Like sometimes it might seem like, I need to consider my rent first because I have to pay that or I get booted out. But I think part of the point of like what you're saying of like sitting down and budgeting year to year is maybe if because of the place you've chosen to live, like it's more expensive than what you actually need. And, there's a lot of nuance to what I'm about to say. So like everybody can make their own decisions here, but like, you might need to move somewhere where rent's cheaper. You might need, if you've got a car payment, maybe you need a less nice car. Like there's sacrifices that you can make or look at even at a yearly level, like to help with that if you are prioritizing, putting God first and that giving first. And, like we've discussed, this I feel like it's challenging for everyone. Money's talked about a lot in the Bible because we struggle with prioritizing worldly possessions and putting those first. But it means so much more when we're giving out of like the little that we have, and that is because it's so much harder for people who have very little to be able to give. Yeah.
I think it's important to train our children.
Mhm.
I know it was always our policy when the kids got their allowance, it was changed, so they could say, okay, we're gonna have so much for church,
Yeah.
and then we do some, try to save some, and then the rest of it, you do what you want to do.
Yeah.
But that training has to start very early. As soon as they have any kind of money, they have to start to learn that God comes first.
Mhm.
And I think if we have that policy, it's easy to train our kids that way too.
Right, they're gonna look to their parents for example first of all, but it's kind of like we've discussed with some of the other things from 2 Corinthians. If we're not in the practice of doing something like we've talked about with like correcting others or being corrected or things like that, if we're not used to giving and putting God first, one, our children aren't going to learn from us to do that, but two, if we don't let them practice that with their own money, then they're not going to be practiced. And when they start to have, when they get their first paycheck, whether they're working something in high school or like college or whatever, they're not going to know how to like say, let me set this aside or let me prioritize this if they weren't given the opportunity to learn that before. Because, I'm sure we've all had different life circumstances, but there is a point, whether it's in high school, college, you don't go to college and go straight to work, or different things happen in life where you kind of have to grow up and figure out how to do things on your own, right? And that there's a lot that goes on in that shift when you're either moving out or like whatever the big life change is. And so the more you have to like figure out net new, the harder that transition is, and you start to like make rationalizations, right? Of like, well, I'm, fresh out of high school and I had all these hard circumstances. And if I'm not used to setting aside money and like practicing and I haven't seen example of that, it can be very difficult. And then, if you find yourself in that situation of you've never done it before, when you're 30, 40, 50, 60, like if you haven't learned how to do that, you're never going to learn how to do it. So we, wherever we might find ourselves in life today, I think it's good for us to like reassess, where our financial priorities are and where God fits into all of that, with some regularity, because it can be easy to kind of put that back of mind. Yeah.
When you go on vacation and that, it's not like a vacation for you to not give to the congregation, because that's what you promised. So you either should make it up if you didn't send it, if you're not doing it automatically online or whatever, but you have to think about that too. The congregation still goes on. You're attending there, you're not gonna be there. It's like, oh, I don't have to give this week because I'm gone.
Yeah.
That's not the purpose of giving.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's like one of the, I mentioned there's pros and cons to like giving online and giving automatically. One of the benefits is you kind of, you can always turn it off, but you kind of lock yourself into at least like what I would call like your baseline level giving of what you've set down for the year and decided that you're supposed to do. And in my head, it's kind of like there's a balance of like sitting down and evaluating that amount with some frequency, right? And that might be every year if that's when your money changes, or maybe more frequently depending on your situation. But also like looking, when there's specific efforts, or if you have the ability to like, make specific sacrifices in your life throughout the year, or even if you have like new money come in, right? Like reassessing that at different times is good for us all to do. And I think that like when we start to, we kind of talked a lot about how to like do this prioritizing of like being willing to give to God and to give to the causes that He, wants us to support other Christians. That helps us with our willingness and our eagerness to do that, because giving is not about how it makes us feel because like, oh, we were able to help this person, but that is a really nice byproduct of it, right? Like when we see that what we have given, or maybe if we've like, done some of the things we mentioned of like I moved to a less nice place, or I got rid of my car, or I downgraded my car or whatever, in the moment you might feel that sadness of like, oh, I lost this thing that I really like. But when you see it going towards something and changing someone else's life, or if people are bringing people to God because of your ability to help support financially, I feel like that makes it go over a little bit easier when we're able to see that. And when you get into the practice of that, you see it regularly, and I think it gets easier and easier. So hopefully that helps us as we think through some of this today. As we go on, let's read verses 13 through 15 in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians 8, 13 through 15. For this is not for the relief of others for your hardship, but by way of equality. At this present time your abundance will serve as assistance for their need, so that their abundance also may serve as assistance for your need, so that there may be equality. As it is written, the one who had gathered much did not have too much, and the one who had gathered little did not have too little. So I think this is one of those, passages that really helps us to understand, like, as we think about like giving and supporting each other, and like giving and supporting other congregations, it is not necessarily like, okay, if the collective income, let's say for math's sake, of this congregation is $1 million, that like the salary for all the people added up for an entire year, right? This verse is not saying like, okay, we need to divide that up amongst all the families and like make everybody 100% equal, right? Like that's not what we're getting at here. And same thing across congregations, right? That isn't the ask across a state or across a country that like, okay, if you're a Christian, we're all pooling into this and we should get all the same amount out. But what it is that there are going to be times where like life might be going better for individuals here, or it might be going better for an entire state, right? Like we've seen disasters in certain states where like maybe we're not getting hit by stuff here in Wisconsin, or different things like that, where we might have an ability to give to help other churches in other states who are really going through something. And I think that's what Paul is getting at here, right? Like the goal of this isn't that I like regularly put myself where there might be a period of time where I might not have everything I want food-wise, or even that, the Macedonians, like we said, gave out of their poverty, for a period of time to help these other Christians who really needed it even more than they did. But it's not such that we're giving ourselves into poverty so regularly that we can't support ourselves and then need support from other people because we have given so much, right? Like there's a balance to this, and we have to understand the situation, especially if we're, giving to that level. If it is a need that really needs that in the moment, then maybe that's appropriate. But we also, might find ourselves in need in the future. So it's like a balance, and it kind of ebbs and flows, as that go. And even, if we think about like when God in Exodus 16:18 was providing like manna and the different food to,
the Israelites at the time, right? Like he set it up so that they could not hoard, too much, right? Like, because even then in that system, like if they kept too much, it would go bad, right? Like they weren't able to keep too much of what they should have, and like that, we, I guess, unfortunately today are able to keep more than we necessarily need, which I think we all enjoy, and like that's a good thing that we can build wealth and have things that we like, but also I think that our ability to do that sometimes puts a barrier between us and God, or a barrier between us and helping other people when we're not focused on the right things. So I think that that's important for us to, keep in mind. So one question I had as we're thinking through this, how do we continue to have an attitude of giving? I think I'm going to say it's slightly easier when we see someone going through a hard time specifically. So if we have an individual here at church who's facing financial hardship, and like everybody kind of agree, like, oh, their house burnt down. Yep, there's no cause for like anybody to say that's not a hardship, right? Or like you have a church, that's going through in a state that has all the wildfires or tornadoes or different things like that. I think we are good as Christians at like working together and unifying to give to those causes, right? But how do we continue to have that attitude if we're not as privy, or if a church just has a need, but like maybe we can't see, specifically what it is, or if we have individuals who are asking for help, but they're maybe not at liberty to share what it is, and we might say, oh, well, they drive this kind of car, they're better off than me. Like, how do we continue to have a good attitude towards giving, like, no matter if we can see, the hardship someone's facing, or if they're just asking for something, and, we might not necessarily be able to see the hardship. How do we continue to have a good attitude?
I think that can apply to a lot of different situations, but anyone have thoughts on how we can do that? Yeah.
Well, one way could be, if you continue to remind yourself that giving is part of worship.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just something that we do, like paying our dues or a subscription or something. It's an act of worship, just like singing and praying, etc. So I think that can help people that want to do that correctly, help them to keep the giving part in the right mindset.
Yeah.
I hate, because of COVID, we do it the way we do it. It's real handy in a lot of ways, but that's when, at least I think, everybody stopped passing the plates and all that. And so we've lost that part. We're still doing it, but it's kind of ripped away from the assembly. But it is part of the worship experience, and so looking at it that way perhaps would help.
Right, and I think that's a good point of like, we talked about when there's specific needs, sometimes it helps motivate us to step up if we know what's going on. But I think if we are trying to give generously each week, even if we don't have a specific cause that's going, we know it's being collected here, we know it's being used appropriately, and some of using it appropriately might be saving up a little bit for when something happens in the future, right? Like, so we are prepared to not do one big collection at that time, but we've saved up to do that. I think that helps because, like, I didn't phrase this question very well, I realize, but like in this example where we're talking about the Corinthians, like giving to those in Jerusalem or other churches, I think it might be easy for them sometimes to be like, well, we're facing all this. Corinth is a tough city, like, do they really have it worse than us? And I think that attitude can happen to us individually or as a congregation sometimes. Like we might, see, and hopefully we don't have this specific attitude, but I think sometimes we just naturally do. Like even if we see a church down in the South that's like struggling financially, we might be tempted to say, well, there are thousands of churches in the South and we're up here in Wisconsin, like, fending for ourselves. Like, we need to avoid that attitude as well of like, oh, they don't have it as bad off as we do. I think there are times with specific situations where we might have to have some scrutiny. I'm not advocating for just saying like somebody on the street, says I need $10,000 for my church and, doesn't give us any more detail that we always have to hand that out. But I think that, we can have bad attitudes that creep in that we got to keep in check. Yeah.
we know that we're going to be blessed, but I personally don't know anybody that's been able to outgive God.
Mhm. Yeah.
He always blesses us more than what we can give.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing for us to keep in mind is he, gives way more than we're ever able to give, but also that he
gives to us even when we might not use it appropriately, right? Like we might not be good stewards of what he gives us at all times, and we also, even if, like, it can be easy to look at somebody who we give money to that even doesn't use the money inappropriately, but might do life things that we don't, necessarily agree with, or they mess up and they sin, and we like might feel, certain things about giving that, but God gives us all these blessings and knows that we're going to mess up and we regularly sin. So I think that's a really good thing for us to keep in mind as far as that. Yeah.
I met a man in the South named Boyd, and his philosophy was give to anybody who asks.
Mm-hmm.
Because he said, it's not my job to judge.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm giving a blessing away, and if they're using it for good, great. If they're not, it's fine as well.
Mhm.
It's all going to be settled in the end anyways.
Yeah, and I think
That is like something that I don't know, like growing up, like we mentioned, I learned kind of a way to look at giving for my parents, and then as you like get out on your own, that changes a little bit as it's your own money, and as you get older, like you have different kind of experiences in life and like figure out how you want to do things differently. But I think that is an attitude, that I'm not saying everyone has to have, but that has helped me kind of to what you're saying of like, okay, before I would have like been like, let me give all this level of scrutiny and let me think through all this and everything, and like at the end of the day, it's better for me just to be generous. And again, there's caveats to everything and there's balance to everything. If it's the same person 23 times and like we know they're not using it appropriately, I can use my own judgment, and God has provided me with a brain to be able to like think through that. But I probably shouldn't angst too much over giving somebody $5 in the street that like I know might not use it for the right thing, but that's the only time I'm going to see them. But everybody can make their own decisions there. But I think that is, if we have a generous heart and we're practiced at giving and helping people, I think we'll get practiced at the situations that we should and maybe shouldn't, as we're good stewards. But good point. Any other thoughts before we keep going? Yeah.
I know a man that had a business, and he had applying, and he was really up there. And so when he would write a check for his contribution, if he felt like, wow, this is, maybe I can't do this, or he would tear it up and write it for more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think there are a lot of things that hopefully we can figure out
in our personal lives that help motivate us and like get us out of our own head in this situation, right? Because I feel like just like when we talk about sin and certain people being susceptible to certain temptations, I feel like there's a whole flavor of that under the money category and what we have, right? Like some people, might find the easiest way to give set amounts to like automate it and set that up, because then they're like, well, it's coming out, I've made this decision or whatever. And then sometimes that might make you never think about what you're doing. And so I think we each have to like assess that and make sure our hearts are in the right place when we're giving and thinking about that. Yeah.
Told him, what the money was for.
Mhm.
He gave him the plan.
Yeah.
He just didn't say, give me money and it's a secret what I'm gonna do with it.
Right.
That doesn't work with our human nature.
Yeah.
Just like when we had the thing for the building and we saw that little thermometer, we
Yes.
saw that, and it should be pretty transparent. I mean, most churches give out some kind of a paper once a year,
Right.
like we've done this, and this, and you know where your money's going. A lot of these charities out there, you might give them money, but you don't know how much is going to administration cost.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know how much goes to a person. Like this clothing drive, every piece of clothing is going to a person.
Yeah.
So we have that transparency. And so I think the way Paul set it up is really good. When the first church we worked at, they had a beautiful building, and all they cared about was paying that building off.
Mm-hmm.
They made double payments. If they got in an extra contribution, it went to that building. They didn't do missions. They didn't do benevolence. We had to like beg to get a vacation Bible school.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, we just don't take that money out of the building fund.
Yeah.
Now, they did, years after we left, a couple of years, they did get their building paid off in 10 years, but they lost almost every person there. They were
Yeah.
down to like 20. You know, they just weren't, you know, how you use that money, and there's a responsibility there. And that's why we should be willing to give, because we know it's being used wisely.
Yeah, and I think I'll be careful with how I'm about to say this because I don't want us to just go like line by line through the budget and go
Yeah.
challenge the elders right now.
But I do think that we all have a responsibility in that regard too, of like keeping an eye on how things are doing. You know, we'll get to the next passage we're going to read about, like how they handled this gift and made sure that everything, you know, was on the up and up, and there was accountability here. But I think it's good for us to, you know, make sure that we're staying involved. Now, the way that the church is set up, like there's elders and deacons, and we know this, and that doesn't mean that we have to be involved in every decision that's ever made financially. But I think we can still be, you know, because where we go to church here, we're transparent about where the money goes. If we have questions, we should be asking about those. If we have concerns about us like not doing enough in an area or us being focused on something, you know, I'm not saying come up while Baxter's preaching and be like, I'm taking my stand to get the church rallied around me. But I think those are like areas that, you know, we can talk to, you know, the elders about or the deacons about if we have specific concerns with how money's being spent. And in my opinion, that's a responsibility that we have, you know, if it's like and that doesn't mean we can always change everything, and that doesn't mean, you know, you can get into some weird scenarios where people are like, well, I don't agree with where the money's going, so I'm not giving, or I'm just immediately going to leave a congregation because of that. I don't think that those are the first steps that you take when you have this disagreement, even if you're told, you know, you bring it up and you're told like, well, no, we're going to continue down this path. But I think we have to be careful, you know, and help keep each other accountable, just like we would for anything else, right? If the church is headed in the wrong direction, or we're not teaching something scripturally or whatever, it kind of depends, right? Is it me up here saying something not scriptural? Is it us as a church heading in the wrong direction? Like, if it's just me, you pull me aside and you know, correct me, as we see examples of. If it's the church by and large and the congregation not headed in the right direction, then, you know, we've got to talk to the elders and like get that sorted out. So I think we, you know, can hopefully use that to have us. I know sometimes we might get the budget and say like, oh yeah, I think things are generally good, but it's probably good for us to give that a once over every once in a while. Yeah.
Charities too, I think you really have to research them before you give to them. I'm going to give one a plug. It's the Church of Christ Disaster. And they show up in any disaster. They bring new things, not used, to all the, you know, to a specific congregation they go, but it goes for the whole, you know, the community in that. So if you like giving to charities, that would be one, because everything that they use, very little goes to, you know, people, because most of it's all from volunteers and that.
Yeah.
So, you know, God gave us a brain, so we need to be active in what we're doing and how we're doing it. You know, like you said, you don't just give haphazardly here and there and this and that and the other. You know, it's okay to help a person if you see a person and they ask for something. That's okay too. But in the long run, if you're going to give a substantial amount someplace, you need to know where and what it's being used for.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good point again. Not a hard and fast rule, but if you're giving $5 and that's not really going to change your day, your level of scrutiny can probably be a little lower there. If you're giving $10,000 to something, you probably want a little more scrutiny of like what it's going to and what it'll be used for. And so like we can each make our like, you know, own judgment and use our heads for that and like, you know, pray about it in different things. But I think that that's, you know, something that we can keep in mind too, as far as like how much sleep we might lose over making a decision around $5 is probably not worth stressing out that much over that amount. But anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and read the rest of the chapter and we can continue some of the conversation we're having, because this talks about some of the accountability that they had, and we can kind of apply that as well. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 16 through 24. But thanks be to God who puts the same earnestness in your behalf in the heart of Titus, for he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest,
He has gone to you of his own accord. We have sent along with him the brother whose fame in the things of the gospel has spread through all the churches. And not only that, but he has also been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administered by us for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our readiness, taking precautions so that no one will discredit us in our administration of this generous gift. For we have regard for what is honorable, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of other people. We have sent with them our brother, whom we have often tested and found diligent in many things, but now even more diligent because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brothers, they are messengers of the churches, a glory to Christ. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and our reason for boasting about you. And so we had started to hit on this with some of what we were just talking about, but I think this shows us that also just because we are giving money to spiritual causes does not mean that we, ourselves don't need accountability, but also the people we are handing that money to need accountability, and kind of everywhere through the pipeline that it goes, like there's accountability. We see here in what we just read, Paul has already, they have experience with Titus, so they have familiarity with him, but also he is giving his reference for the other men who will be helping bring this gift to Jerusalem and where it needs to go. And I think that's important for us to understand as well. We talked about this a little bit last week, but I think it's very important, one, as we give here at the congregation, that we're making sure, through various means that's actually making it to the bank account. And then from there, like I just mentioned, when we look at budgets and we look at different things, is the money being generally spent in, good ways and things like that. But this also applies, like we've mentioned, if you're giving money to other churches or helping out missionaries or whatever. And again, that to me, one, there's about the transport and the money or whatever you're getting there. And then also there's a balance in it's going to slow everything down if you check absolutely everything that's done. If we said as a congregation, the way we're going to do this is before we're willing to give money to anyone who comes and asks, we're going to call the entire congregation and say, can I give this $20 to this person? That's never going to work, right? If the elders or the deacons or whoever's in charge of that had to talk to every one of us before they were ever benevolent, that's not going to work. But also, if to the points that were made earlier, if we as a church are only focused on building and taking care of ourselves and things like that, we want to make sure that we are keeping things accountable. So does anybody have either church, going here or churches you've been to, any thoughts on first of all, how we, can in practice make sure that we are, accountably handling the money even before we try to spend it? I know in the past here when we had more giving in person, that a lot of times we would have two men count the money and go through, so we can kind of verify each other and then make sure that total got to, whoever was going to be taking that to the bank, and there was kind of a checks and balances system there. Are there other things that you've seen at churches that you've been to, for keeping kind of the money transfer accountable? Yeah.
Well, one thing is just, for me, the last two congregations I've been to, you just go and get a copy of the budget.
Mhm.
The one congregation, it's the first Sunday of the month, they would sort of run down,
Yeah.
some of the spending, so we sort of heard that, at that service or whatever, so that was one thing. Other congregations, multiple people have sort of been there to make sure and cross-check when they're counting the money, and then having a backup person if something happens or someone is not there. But those are some of the kinds of things, or even sometimes having a meeting and just sort of going through that or discussing, some of those kinds of things. So those are some of the accountability factors that I've seen.
Yeah, and I think just generally transparency in this area is good.
Whatever mechanisms that we might have to follow it. I'm sure we have all worked or known of different things in the secular world where, different people were skimming off the top, or different things where you're how could have this gone on for so long, for years and years and years, where people were either taking money out of the register or they were taking money out of bank accounts or whatever might happen. And the way that happens is if there's not enough accountability, right? And so for us to make sure that's not happening with what we're giving here, I think that's where like transparency is important. And then also, like we've mentioned, if we're giving to charities, if we're giving to missionaries, like I think it can be a little more challenging when we don't see the people regularly or whatever, but like a lot of times missionaries will send reports, so they will give updates on what's happening, right? And I think the tough thing is we don't need to equate that to like, oh, this missionary saved 100 souls a week and this person was 2 souls in a year, right? Like I think there is some, level of wiseness that we can apply to situations and try to have an understanding of why those two situations might be different, and outcomes aren't just measured in like the souls that a specific person is able to convert. We can look through the Old and New Testament and see, Noah was able to save just his family. We have evangelists, if we look at like Paul and the apostles who went around and there were 3,000 baptized in one day. We can't just look at that and say who was more successful, the apostles on the day of Pentecost or Noah. Like it's not a apples to apples comparison there, and it's the same way with missionaries. But also, if we send money off to somebody, we don't hear from them for 3 years, it wasn't that anything happened to them and they're just not spending it on anything for furthering the cause of God, then that is a situation where we probably would not continue to send that person money. So I think that there are like balances there too, and it helps, like as we see in this passage, if we look at it in like, especially if we know someone, even if we don't know that person directly, if we know honorable men or women who are involved in that from a church perspective, and we trust that person, then we can kind of trust the other person through that person that we trust that's given them a reference. Because if we think about it, like Paul, for the Corinthians here, like it's unlikely that they they knew Titus from before, what we talked about before, but the other two men that are mentioned here, like they might have heard about at least one of them, but like they don't know specifically who they are necessarily, and maybe haven't met them face to face. But Paul is giving these references so they know that they can trust them, right? And in the same way, whether we're talking about counting money here or sending it off, or like when Stuart does a lot of the budget stuff, right? Like we want somebody in that position that we trust to do the thing. We might still need to have some level of accountability there, but you're not going to put somebody in charge of dealing with the money that has had problems in the past with dealing with money and like skimming off the top and things like that. So I think we can go both ways of having way too much scrutiny sometimes, and I think sometimes in the church we can say like, oh, we're all people, we're all Christians trying our hardest, nobody would ever use money incorrectly, and that's also not true, right? Like we're all tempted, we all know that we face things, so I think we've got to learn a balance there of like keeping each other accountable and making sure that we're using money properly, because like we've mentioned a bunch of times already before, like God blesses us with all of this and asks us to be good stewards of what he gives us, and that is what we've talked about today is part of us being good stewards. So I think these are important principles for us to keep in mind. Any other thoughts on just the general thought of accountability? Yeah.
It's not always that you don't trust the person, but it's for the appearance of things.
Yeah.
How things might look to someone else.
Right.
That they think there's something going on that's not, and not even going to be, but it's still for the people involved.
Right.
Feel like nobody has to question because there's somebody.
Yeah, in my notes I had, like, it's even like when you talk about like the qualifications of being an elder, right? Like where they're blameless and above reproach, which doesn't mean that they're never gonna like mess up or make mistakes, but like even the
Well, it
appearance.
doesn't mean we don't look at what
Right.
they're doing to see if it's,
Right.
to be sure, and it's just,
And
it's better that way.
and so we don't expect, not saying that
Like elders and deacons and everybody don't mess up just like we do, but also like there is an expectation for them, and it should also apply to us as Christians, that we shouldn't be the type of person that somebody like has a question about where we're going and or what we're doing or whatever, and like they're like, I could really see that Josh would be involved in this. It should be the opposite, right? Of like, oh, I know Josh is a person, and like generally I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt because I know he like handles things on the up and up. Like we want that same attitude for handling our money, the men in charge of that, and the different people we might interact with like giving money to, we want to make sure that like we are doing things in such a way that it's transparent. And I think that helps like for us in the congregation not to judge or wonder a thing. You know, if we know it's accountable and we're helping in part of that process, then it helps us to not have a bad attitude as well. Patsy?
Well, it also says that an elder's not supposed to be a novice, so,
Mhm.
you know, hopefully he's grown
Yeah.
better than someone who's a new Christian that, you know, may like stumble more than
Right.
someone that's been a Christian for long enough to not be a novice anymore.
Yeah, and I think that like a lot of those things, you know, the qualifications of elders and the qualifications of deacons are things that generally most of them we should strive for as Christians and following in the church. And I think that's, you know, something, even that there's no like specific requirement that like the person or the people who are like taking the money to the bank or doing the things are elders or deacons. Like we want, you know, a lot of the same qualities from people handling the money that they are, you know, on the up and up, and people that we can trust with that task. Just like with anything in the church, right? Like even when we have people mow or do whatever, you generally would want somebody who knows what they're doing in the task, right? Like there might be a learning period where a newer Christian or someone who's newer is learning how to do something from someone else. But generally, like any time that we're taking care of what God has blessed us with, we want to do it to the best of our ability and make sure that we're learning. Any other last minute thoughts as we close out chapter 8? All right, if not, thanks for a good class. We'll pick up in chapter 9 next week.